There's a lot of stories in this church about what God has done in a lot of people's lives. And I love hearing those testimonies and seeing the stories about new beginnings that people have. As a church, we're doing this series on Joshua and the new beginnings that happen. And Tammy's life is one of those stories. And I think it's fabulous. I know that there are people here that wish that they could have a new beginning. Maybe you're dealing with trying to save a marriage, or maybe you're trying to dig out of a financial pit, or maybe every day you wake up and you're just physically in pain. Whatever it is, there are times that it just seems overwhelming. It seems like there's no way that things can get any better. And that's why we're doing this series talking about new beginnings, because when we trust in God, when we follow Him, He can start over in our life. And the example we're going to be using today is the example of the nation of Israel as they're getting ready to go into the promised land. God had promised them a great future, an incredible inheritance. But as they get there, it's a little scary. It's overwhelming. They feel like there's no way that this can happen. When Moses and the Israelites went there the first time, Moses sent spies into the land, and this is the report they had as they are supposed to go and take over this land. It said, the people there are powerful. Their cities are fortified, and they're very large. The land we explored devours those who are living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes and looked the same to them. And so when the spies bring back this report, they go, it's scary, it's overwhelming, it's just way too big. There's no way that we can conquer this. And they had forgotten God. They had forgotten all that God had done for them in the past. And so what we're going to look at is what happens next. That group of people who spied out that land and were too afraid to trust God in that, they went and they wandered in the desert for 40 years. But now they've come back, and now Moses is no longer their leader, but Joshua has just taken over being in charge. And so I think that Joshua has some fear. I think he has some doubts. And that's why in Joshua 1, God talks to Joshua and gives him a message. And there's some principles in there that we can look at today to deal with the things that seem overwhelming in our lives. And so if you have a Bible, turn to Joshua chapter 1. If you don't have a Bible, there should be one on the chairs in front of you. It's page 151. You can turn that in your phone, your tablet, you can find it. If you have your own Bible, Joshua is toward the beginning of the Bible, after the book of Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then Joshua. Joshua 1, as God has put Joshua in charge, He gives him a message, and this is what it says, starting in verse 6. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their forefathers to give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. I don't know if you picked up on it or not, but 3 different times in God's message to Joshua, He says, be strong and courageous. And as you read through this, you see that there are 3 things that God is trying to say. He says, be strong and courageous, do this. And those principles are ones that we can learn from today. And so the first one is this: be strong and courageous as you lead people. Be strong and courageous as you lead people. Verse 6, God says, be strong and courageous because you will lead these people to inherit the land that I swore to their forefathers to give them. For hundreds of years, God had been telling the nation of Israel, hey, you're going to be here, but soon you'll be in a land, a promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey. It's going to be your homeland. It's a place that I have set aside for you to live. And so it's something the nation had looked forward to for a really long time. And they were really close to getting it, and they blew it. And for 40 years, they've had to know that they've been wandering in the desert, knowing that their parents or their grandparents, they made the decision, and because of those decisions, they're not there. And so Joshua's job now, he's to be the leader. This thing that they've been looking forward to for so long, now he is supposed to be the one that gets them in there. And that's what God has called him to do. And Joshua has that privilege. And today, 2,000, 3,000 years later, we are reading this story about Joshua and what he did. Leadership, it's a privilege. Leadership is it's one of those things that we like. We like being in charge. We like being the one to say, here's how it's going to go. There's some power that comes with being in charge. There's prestige. You get noticed. Your name gets remembered. But leadership is also, it's a responsibility. It takes time and energy. It takes perseverance. It takes character. Joshua had to plan and prepare. He had to meet with people and get everything organized so that people could go into the land. In general, I think people love the perks of leadership, but we tend to shirk from the responsibility. As followers of Jesus, whether you like it or want it or not, you are a leader. And you are going to be given opportunities to lead people to Jesus. You see, God has an inheritance for us as well. In 1 Peter 1:3, it says this, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade, kept in heaven for you." Part of the deal of being followers of Jesus is we've got a relationship, a new beginning in Jesus Christ here on this earth. And as great as that is, there's something even better in heaven. And I'll tell you what, the older I get, the more forward I look to get into heaven. I think it's going to be a fabulous place, and there's not going to be a lot of stuff that we have to deal with on this earth. But as followers of Jesus, he has put us in a position where we have to lead other people to that inheritance. We lead them to Jesus Christ. That's a part of our responsibility. It's a part of our privilege of being followers of Jesus, is that we lead others to do the same thing. Moms have an incredible opportunity to lead their children to know God. I don't know how much of the NBA you watch, but there's they just came out with the MVP this year. His name is Steph Curry. Steph Curry the dude's a shooter. I mean, he just lights it up. After he makes a shot, though, he points up to heavens, and he does that as a reminder to himself that God is the one who has given him these abilities. Beyond that, Steph Curry has his own line of shoes. And on his own line of shoes, on the tongue, it says 4:13. And that 4:13 is a reference to Philippians 4:13, which says, "I can do all things through Christ who's given me strength." And it's really cool to see the MVP of the league is a very devout Christian. He's a devout follower of Jesus Christ. Where did he get this idea of pointing to God when he makes a shot? His mom. His mom's suggestion, hey, why don't you point to God as a reminder to yourself so your head doesn't get a little bit too big? You can remember it's God who's given you these abilities. Where did he get this idea of knowing the Bible and saying, I don't want to put the scripture on the shoes that I'm endorsing? He did, his family did morning devotions every morning. And so when he was growing up, he spent a lot of time in God's Word. He said, I want to live that out today. Jesus said that we are the light of the world. And we have opportunities all the time to affect other people for Jesus Christ. Now, you are probably, and me, we're probably not going to be on stage so that everybody in the entire country knows who we are. That's probably not going to be that. But in the world that we live in, with the places that we work, the family members that we interact with, the friends that we keep, we are the light of their world. And when you act like it, you never know the impact or the influence it's going to have. But I think as followers of Christ, there are too many times where we back off. God's given us a responsibility. He's given us the opportunity, and we're like, yeah, I just don't know that I can do it. And that's why I think this passage is so important for us to remember. We need to be strong and courageous when we have those opportunities. When we're at work and we're having a conversation with someone and it gets right to the point where we could start talking about God or the church or what Jesus has done in my life, and we're getting right up to there and we're like, and we're confronted with a choice. Am I going to be strong and courageous and take this on, or am I going to shrink back from it? For Joshua, his task, overwhelming. Trying to lead probably 2 million people and trying to go through all the battles and everything that was going to take, that's something to shrink back from. I think that's one of the reasons God said, be strong and courageous as you lead these people. because this is a very important time. They're going to get into the place that they've looked forward to for hundreds of years. Be strong and courageous as you lead people. Second, God goes on and says, be strong and courageous as you obey God's law. Look at verse 7. As God is telling him, he says, be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you'll be prosperous and successful. God told Joshua, hey, you are a leader. You're going to be leading these people, but you need to make sure that you're obeying God's law. I mean, this part of God's command to Joshua, this part of it, it's twice as big as the other parts. And God spends a lot of time focusing on obeying God's law. Why is that? Because I think it takes courage to obey God's law. Not just courage, but look, he says, be strong, be very courageous. When you read God's commands and you see that God says, okay, you need to do this, most of the time we see the obstacles. We see the reasons why we can't do what God says. And ultimately, we're scared to do it because we don't know how it's going to turn out. Faithful obedience to God shows up in a lot of places in our life. You know, God says, don't have sex outside of marriage. God says, be a hard worker, even when your boss isn't watching. God says, learn to be content with life. God says, love your enemies. You know, God says a lot of things. I think one of the hardest places of obedience for people, though, has to do with their money. I think one of the hardest places it is for people to trust in God has to do with their finances. It's in the area of tithing. You know, Proverbs chapter 3, verse 9 says, honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all of your crops. You know, God says that we need to give to him first. And I think that's why he says to Joshua, be strong and be very courageous to obey my laws, because most of the time when it comes to following God's laws, we shrink back. And God says very clearly multiple times throughout the Bible, give to him first. And there are so many times that we look at our income and we look at our bills, which are the obstacles, and we make a decision to, I'll trust God in some other way, or I'll trust him later. And we're not very courageous in these things. But God has rules, and he has them for reasons. And God expects us to follow his rules. Your mom, when you're growing up, she gave you all kinds of rules. She gave, most of our moms kind of said the same things. What would happen if mom just kind of did a 180? Well, there's a lot of things that your mom would never say to you. I mean, can you imagine your mom saying this? Let me smell that shirt. Yeah, it's good enough for another week. No, mom wouldn't say that. Or what if your mom said, you know what? When you get right down to it, I am your cleaning lady. I'm your maid. Your mom's not going to say that. Or if you can't say something nice about a person, just text them. Or if you're sitting there at the dinner table and you're not eating your food, she says, you know those starving kids in Ethiopia? Well, they wouldn't eat this junk either. Or can you imagine your mom coming up to you and saying, you know what? I can understand you so much better when you whine. That's awesome. There's a lot of things that moms wouldn't say because it's not true. It's not in her nature. It doesn't go with everything else she's told us. You know what? God has rules, and God has told us to obey them. And we need to obey God's commands even when we don't see how it's going to turn out. That's what faith is. It's following God and doing the things he tells us to do even when we can't see how we're going to overcome it. Are you willing to be obedient? Are you willing to follow the stuff that God says even if you don't know how it's going to turn out? In this area of giving, are you willing to be obedient to God and do the things he commands? Do you have the strength and the courage to make that happen? What about telling the truth? Are you strong and courageous enough to tell the truth? Your boss at work says, hey, man, our numbers are not what they need to be. I need you just to massage those numbers a little bit. Make it look just a little bit better for us. Are you willing to stand up and say, you know what? I can't do that. I can't put down a false report, even if it means that you lose your job. You know, God says, love our enemies. That's a hard one. I think in a church setting today, I think it's kind of easy to love the people around us. Because honestly, we kind of all agree in general. When we show up, we kind of know what's going to happen on Sunday morning. And if there are people that we don't really get along with that well, we can just sit on the opposite side of the church. So we just kind of be nice to the people we want to be nice to. But we haven't had a lot of fights breaking out on Sunday mornings that I remember, because we're people that are kind of heading in general the same direction. But God says, love your enemies. And so that person at work or that family member or that your neighbor, and you have continual issues with them and they're just a jerk, loving them is one of the things God commands us to do. What kind of strength does it take? What kind of strength does it take to be nice to this person you're sharing a row with this morning? Not a lot. What kind of strength does it take when you get home and your neighbor has done something else to tick you off? Yeah, it takes strength and it takes courage. Or maybe it's forgiving someone. Someone has hurt you in the past. They've done something that's been absolutely wrong. And you said, you know what? What you did was wrong. What you did hurt me. And I don't know that you're ever going to change, but I want to let you know, when you did this to me, I've been so mad and so angry at you for so long. I forgive you for that. Joshua had to be strong and very courageous to obey God's law, to obey his commands, because the task that he had was enormous. And we may not ever have to lead 2 million people, but God has called us to be strong and very courageous in obeying his words today, this week in our lives. And we've got to make a choice whether we're going to stand up and be strong and courageous, or if we're going to back off. The third thing that God tells Joshua is this: be strong and courageous as you overcome discouragement. As you overcome discouragement, there in verse 9, God says, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Man, there are so many times that discouragement sets in, and it just kills us. God knew that Joshua was going to get discouraged. That's why he had the conversation with him up front. He had a huge task. Not only did he have to lead these people, he had to lead them into this land, and they had to go to battle. And for 5 years, they were going to be fighting against the people in that land. And not only did he have to be a great general, but he also had to make sure that everybody in the country had food, that they had housing. And then in the middle of all that, he had to deal with the complaints and the criticism that went with the job. I mean, if you're in a leadership position, you know it doesn't matter what you do, someone's not going to be happy. And if there's more than one person involved, there's going to be complaints, there's going to be criticism. And so God knew that Joshua could be easily discouraged. It's scary and it's overwhelming. And at some point, Joshua could say, you know what, just forget this. There is no way I can make this happen. Because in life, it's easy to get discouraged and just give up. It just reminds me of one day this little girl was sitting and watching her mom do the dishes. She kind of looked at her mom and just kind of looked closely, because her mom had this beautiful dark hair. And she looks, Mom, you've got some white hairs sticking out there. Where are those white hairs coming from? And her mom said, well, every time you do something wrong, make me cry or make me unhappy, one of my hairs turns white. Just how brutal is that? Well, the little girl thought about it for a minute and said, well, Mom, why are all of Grandma's hairs white? A little change of perspective there. But there are things in our life that gets us discouraged. There are things in life that just get us to a place where we just want to quit. Why do those things happen? I read recently there's 4 main causes of discouragement. They're failure, fatigue, frustration, and fear. Failure causes discouragement. When you have an overwhelming task, whatever it is that you're dealing with, and you put your heart and your soul in it, and you work hard, and at the end of all that time, it fails, that's discouraging. And it makes you just want to quit and give up and say, you know what, I'm never going to do this again. But you need to understand that we all fail. We all have failed. We've all failed at something. And the question in this life is not whether or not you're going to fail. That's already a given. The question is what's going to happen after you fail, and how are you going to respond to that? Be strong and courageous. Sometimes we get discouraged because of fatigue. We're just physically or emotionally, we're just worn out. We're exhausted. And it's just like, I don't feel like getting up. I'm so discouraged by all this. I just want to give up. We just watched the movie Selma. And I don't know how accurate it is historically, but it's very interesting to me that as Martin Luther King was in Selma and he was trying to lead the civil rights movement in parts of this, they were going to march from Selma to the Capitol. As they were getting ready to put that together, Martin Luther King did not participate in that first march. The one that's called Bloody Sunday, where all the violence erupted. He wasn't there. According to the movie, at least, he went back home because there was some exhaustion. I mean, his wife, his kids, he went back home and just was with them. I think there was emotional and or physical fatigue that was there. And when we get in that way, it's easy for us to get discouraged. It's easy for us to say, you know what, I'm done. And so we need to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves, that physically and emotionally, so that we have the reserves to do the things that God's called us to do. Another part of discouragement is frustration. You know, when you have a whole lot of responsibilities and they just keep piling on, and the more that you're feeling overwhelmed, more stuff comes. You know, in those times of life, there's times that we need to reorganize our life. We need to say no to some things and start doing some things differently. And then one of the biggest parts of discouragement, one of the biggest causes is fear. And I think a lot of people back off from their leadership role that God has called us to share Christ with people. I think a lot of people get discouraged and quit because of fear of criticism. What will people say about me? Fear of the responsibility because it just is an overwhelming weight. Fear of failure. You know, when we get in those places and we get discouraged and we want to give it up, I think it's good to remember that God's with us. The writer of Hebrews says this: God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. So we say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? In those times that we have fear, we need to remember that God, He is not going to leave us. He's not going to let us out on our own. He's going to be with us. He is with us. And I know people have issues with that at times because they're like, I can't see God. How do I even know that He's on my side? How can I know that He's with me? Remember that God is like the wind. We can't see the wind. We can see the effects of the wind, but we can't see the wind itself. No one would doubt or deny that wind is there. I grew up in southwest Kansas. I tell you, the wind is there. We can't see it, but it doesn't mean it's not there. Well, the same thing is true with God. We can't see Him, but we can see Him working. We can see His effects in our life, in the lives of other people. When we pay attention, we can see Him working. When we're seeking after Him, we can see Him working. And when you go through that and you're dealing with discouragement, you need to remember that God is there and He is with you. And you can say with confidence, I'm not going to be afraid of people. I'm not going to be afraid of what they could say or do to me, because ultimately God is on my side and He's bigger than whatever issues that I'm dealing with. We need to be strong and courageous because God has called us to lead people. Just like God called Joshua to lead the Israelites into the promised land, God has called us to lead people into a relationship with Jesus Christ, into an inheritance that will never fade. That's what God has called us to do. And we need to make sure that we obey God's laws, because when people watch us, they should get a picture of Jesus Christ. Because that's who He's called us to be. And there are times that we work with people and we put everything we can into someone and we see them turn away, and it's discouraging. But God says that we can overcome discouragement. How do we do these things? By remembering that we need to be strong and courageous. That we keep going after failure, and remember that we're not alone. Remember that God is here, but He's also put us with a body of believers to help encourage and strengthen us. For Joshua, God said, be strong and courageous, I'm with you. But then watch people's reactions there in verse 16. The people answered Joshua, whatever you have commanded us, we will do. Wherever you send us, we will go. Just as we fully obeyed Moses, so we will obey you. Only may the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your word and does not obey your words, whatever you may command them, will be put to death. Only be strong and courageous. I don't know how this worked out. I know that God talked to Joshua and said, okay, be strong and courageous 3 different times. I don't know if Joshua told the people, or if the people saw Joshua and because of the way they're repeating, it was a great sense of unity there for Joshua, that they said to Joshua the exact same thing that God said to Joshua. Be strong and courageous. But the people said, regardless, they said, hey, wherever you're going, we're going to follow you. We got your back. We understand that God's put you in this position, and we're going to follow you. You follow God. You do what he says. We will follow you. You just stand up and be courageous. Isn't it great? Isn't it great when you got someone on your side saying, hey, you know what? You can do this. And in the church, God has filled the church with people who say, you know what? God has called us to lead people to Christ. He's called you to do this in this situation, and I'm with you. God has surrounded us with people who have our back. God's bigger than our situation, and he's put people in our place to help us. That's why the church is supposed to be. It's who he's called us to be. If you're not a follower of Jesus, I want to encourage you to take a stand. I want to encourage you to have courage and say, you know what? I want to be a part. I want God on my side. So I want to join him. I want to join his family. And I want to be a part of a church that's trying to stand up and be courageous like God has called us to be. So yeah, I want to be a part of this church. And so I just ask that everybody would stand up where you are. And if you're not a follower of Jesus, or if you've never placed your membership in this church, then I'm asking you to take a step of courage today. Just walk down this aisle. I'll be right up here in the front. We'll have some people that can meet with you, can talk with you, share with you what it means to be a follower of Jesus and to stand. Would you come right now as we sing this song?